Hey guys, welcome to Elevated Systems. I'm your host CJ, and it's been an exciting and maybe disappointing couple of months for new PC tech with the launch or, non-launch of the new NVIDIA graphics cards, Ryzen 5000 series CPUs, and the upcoming launch of Big Navi. There's been a lot to be excited about, but for me, there's nothing I've been looking forward to more than the inevitable release of this, the Fractal Meshify 2. Now, I've worked with Fractal in the past, and they did send me this case to review, but I didn't have any inside knowledge of its release. However, knowing Fractal's playbook, I was pretty sure this case in some form was coming as soon as they released the Define 7. Fractal builds a solid base chassis and uses that chassis to construct various styles of cases. We've seen this evolution before, most recently with the Define R6, which was further refined as the Define S2, from which became the Meshify S2, which is the direct predecessor of this case. And this case is built on the Define 7 chassis. So the agenda today is, first, I'll go over some of the key features of the Meshify 2, especially focusing on the difference between the Meshify 2 and its predecessor, the Meshify S2. Then I'm going to demonstrate how to convert the case into storage mode. Next, I'll be building a high-end workstation because, like I always say, you can't really get to know a case until you build in it. Finally, I'll come back and give you my final thoughts on the Fractal Meshify 2. So let's get to it. This is a mid-tower ATX case measuring in at 18.7 inches tall by 9.4 inches wide by 21.2 inches deep. It holds ATX, micro ATX, mini ITX motherboards, and ETX boards up to 185 millimeters wide. It supports graphics cards up to 491 millimeters or 460 millimeters with the front fan installed, and CPU coolers up to 185 millimeters. It comes with 3 Fractal design dynamic X2 140mm fans installed, 2 in the front and 1 in the rear, and the case can support up to 9 140mm or 120mm fans, all behind easily removable nylon filters. Additionally, the case supports multiple radiator configurations up to 420mm radiators at the top, up to 360 or 280 millimeters radiators at the front, and up to a 280 millimeter radiator on the bottom. And the plastic expansion covers pop off to provide an additional 60 or 136 millimeters of depth to fit radiators and fans in the front. There's a fan hub installed capable of supporting 3 PWM fans and 6 3-pin fans. Storage-wise, there is an included drive cage to hold 2 3.5-inch hard drives or 2 2.5-inch SSDs, as well as 2 mounting plates for 2.5-inch SSDs. There's also a single Fractal multi-bracket installed which can hold an additional drive. There are an additional 4 drive trays included with the case for a possibility of mounting up to 9 drives. Storage can further be expanded to a maximum of 18 drives when configured in storage layout. The storage options for this case are really almost endless. There's 30 millimeters of cable management space and options including cable guides, 5 Velcro straps, and 17 tie-out points. The front I/O includes 2 USB 3.0 Type A ports, as well as a USB 3.1 Gen 2 Type C. There are separate headphone and microphone jacks, and your power and reset buttons. There are 7 bridgeless PCIe expansion slots, as well as 2 vertical slots. All the panels are toolless removable, so just like previous versions of the case used to have the one clip on the side here to remove both the front panel and the rear panel. The entire front panel is removable too, but one thing that they picked up from the Define 7 is rather than removing the entire bezel, you can just pop this open like a door to get access to your fans, and this door pops right off and gives you access to the front filter. We also have our bottom full fine mesh filter. One of the first big changes from the Meshify S2 is you pull off the front panel, but the front I/O is incorporated into the case itself and not attached to the front panel. So this entire front panel removes. The other change is in the Meshify S2, just this middle mesh piece popped off. Now our entire top panel comes off. Again, we have a filter that's underneath the top panel, but if you do remove that, you're just left with a nice top panel and that doesn't look like there's something missing. All right, I've already overviewed a lot of the cable management here. Another removable part is this little basement shroud. So our power supply basement has this little plastic shroud that helps you hide and manage the cables underneath there. So if you got some junk in the trunk, you can just hide it. And because this is the Define 7 chassis, again, 2 screws right here on the top. And the top fan radiator bracket removes. And now we have a nice open, unrestricted area so we can easily build our system in this case. Now I'm gonna show you is how to turn the case into its secondary mode or its storage mode, where we can add a whole lot of drive bays to this case. So what we're gonna do is we're gonna remove this panel and move it forward. So to do that, we have 5 screws, 1, 2, 3, one on the top, one on the side here. So we remove these screws. Then we can remove this entire panel here. All right. We also can remove our little plastic pop-out panels. Right. Now this panel, we have one of the Fractal multi-brackets on the back of this panel, which I don't particularly need. But to remove this little plastic shell also pops right off. Little tabs here. And that comes off. So now we can remove our multi-bracket. And these multi-brackets will attach anywhere there's a fan mount. Anywhere a fan mounts to this case, one of these multi-brackets will attach to. So you can attach a 3.5 or a 2.5 inch hard drive. Okay, now that I got that multi-bracket off, I can leave this plastic panel off for now. I'm just gonna set this whole thing aside. I'm gonna pull my last tray out of my bottom drive cage. And then I'm gonna actually remove this entire drive cage, because instead of using this bottom as a storage area, I'm actually gonna remove the drive cage and mount a fan down here for additional airflow. And you'll see why as I get into the build. But to remove that drive cage, simply flip the case over and you have 4 screws here. And if you just loosen these screws, this allows you to slide your drive cage forward or backwards, and there's quite a bit of room. And to remove the drive, you can lift it straight out from those where you pulled those plastic pop-off panels, expansion panels, or it'll actually, if you need to, you can slide it right through the power supply opening in the rear, and that's it. Got the drive tray removed. Now, let's set up our expansion. So I'm gonna take that panel that I removed from the rear of the case, and I'm going to add it to the front of the case here, just by screwing it right back into the case like I unscrewed it, using the same screws. The one on the bottom, you can reach right through the front of the case here. It's helpful to have a longer screwdriver. And then when I replace the top panel, the 5th screw will screw right into the top here. And now I can add my drive trays here, and we have 9 positions to add up to 9 hard drive trays here. And these trays hold both 2.5 inch SSDs as well as the 3.5 inch mechanical hard drives. And there's a little notch here that slides right into opening there, and then the thumb screw screws in the front. And then using the same type of screws that we use to mount the panel, from this side we can attach the tray. Let me get all of these installed. Now with all those installed, I can snap this plastic panel back in place. Give it a nice clean look. Now I have space here for 5 more drives. I actually have 6 drives coming for this workstation that I'm gonna set up in RAID 5 here. I just wasn't able to get them here in time for this case review, but now it's all set up, ready for them. All right, let's get to the rest of this build. Okay, another important thing to note here. I mentioned that this case supports EATX motherboards up to 285 millimeters. Now, I need to point out that anything over 265 millimeters is gonna pass your cable routing grommet here. The motherboard I'm using is 277 millimeters, so I'm going to block about half of this cable routing grommet. So to make sure I can get my cables through this grommet, I went ahead and passed them through before placing the motherboard, as well as the one SATA data cable that I need to use right now. Okay, Let's start with the build experience, and because I did build this system in storage layout, I'll be focusing on that. Having built in desktop server style enclosures in the past, I can say that Fractal's solution to this is a good compromise between convenience and cost. While a typical desktop server chassis with front-mounted drive bays like this will have very convenient features like hot swappable front-loading bays, those cases start at over $500. This case only costs about $140 US, and while this is a bit higher than some of the recent airflow-focused cases, I personally don't think this case is comparable to something like the Corsair 4000X or the Lian Li Landcool 215 or, well, anything. I can't think of anything on the market right now with this storage capacity at this price point. Now, I'm sure someone will probably remind me in the comments, but don't say the Define 7. That's cheating. Anyway, as far as converting to the storage layout, it was pretty simple and straightforward. Again, Fractal includes some of the best user's guides in the business, so when in doubt, read the freaking manual. Now, when using this enclosure in storage mode, there are a few things to keep in mind. First, the maximum length of your graphics card is reduced to 315 millimeters. Now, if the width of the card with the power connectors is less than 150 millimeters, then it can extend into the storage area, but then of course you lose some of that storage capacity. Second thing, I ran into an issue when installing my AIO radiator on the top of the case. Now, the user's guide does state that a 420 millimeter radiator is not supported when in storage layout, but I went with a 360 millimeter rad, so I assumed I'd have no problems. Problem is, there was a problem. See, the Asus ROG Zenith Extreme Alpha motherboard has a tall, actively cooled heatsink at the top of the board, which interfered with the AIO radiator fans. And because of the panel now here in the front of the case, I'm not able to move the radiator over to the outside mounting positions. Because of this, the top fan / radiator mounting bracket wouldn't slide all the way back into place when trying to reinstall it. It was only off by about a millimeter, but because of the very tight tolerances of the case, this didn't allow me to screw the panel back on. Now, I was able to fix this by simply drilling out the mounting holes on the fans a little wider to allow the fan to shift over slightly, but modding things is what I do. For the average builder, this is something to keep in mind. However, with that said, a lot of stars have to align to produce that particular issue. The case and storage layout, actively cooled or very tall top VRM heatsink, and a top mounted 360 millimeter radiator. So I'm not gonna call that a design failure, just something to keep in mind. The only other little annoyance is that once you move the panel forward to this position, the little tabs you need to pop out from behind to remove the plastic panel are blocked by the fan. So removing that panel to reconfigure or remove a drive sled is now more difficult. Now, I was easily able to pop the plastic cover off with a plastic spudger from my iFixit kit, but it's much easier to do with less possibility of damage by being able to just pop them out from behind. Now, though I made the conscious choice to put a 277 millimeter eATX board in this case, I want to reiterate that any motherboard between 265 and 285 millimeters will partially or completely cover the cable pass-throughs. So I mentioned that to say if you're planning an eATX build and we're considering this case, maybe consider stepping up to the XL version, which is exactly what my Fractal rep told me when I told him about the build I was planning. But I'm stubborn and I'll just make it work, even if it involves power tools. Don't be stubborn like me, buy the shoe that fits. Moving on to cable management, because this particular build presented some unique challenges in that aspect too, because the two 8-pin EPS cables connect to the front of the board, I had to route them along the same path as the 24-pin cable, along with some of the fan cables. The Thermaltake fans I'm going with have some pretty beefy proprietary cables that need to be connected to a proprietary fan hub. However, this case handled my clump of cables like a champ. Now, the plastic routing thingies are removable, and if the mass of cables interfered with the rear panel, I planned to remove them so I could lay the cables more flat, but the 30 millimeters of space was more than adequate, and the side panel and even the external PSU cable shroud went on without issues. So if I was able to do that with all of this in about 15 minutes, I'm pretty confident cable management won't be an issue for most everyone in this case. As far as other build notes, one of the things I really appreciate is the two-piece rear panel that recesses the I/O and expansion slots into the case. This is something that may be overlooked, but anyone who's ever installed or removed a GPU into a case with the flush PCI expansion slots with that cutout for the bracket like the P400A I was using before today, anyone with a motherboard with a plate around the PCI slots knows what I'm talking about. With this setup, you just slide the GPU into the PCI slot and it lines up right on top of the mounting point. Also in this build, if the rear fan was mounted flush with the I/O, the fan would block half the LCD display on the motherboard. I mean, not a huge deal, but I did pay for that option, so. Now, there are two vertical PCIe slots for vertically mounting a 2-slot graphics cards, but these slots are pretty close to the glass panel and will definitely hinder thermal performance. However, if you're not water cooling and want to vertically mount your GPU in this case, it is compatible with the Fractal Flex B20 PCIe riser, which will push the card much further away from the panel. Anyway, despite the self-inflicted problems, the build went smoothly, and I expect 98+% of people won't run into any problems. Next, let's talk about performance. Now, I did replace the included Dynamic X2 fans with a much more expensive alternative because, well, RGB. I mean, that's gonna get me like a 10% performance boost. And I saw it on Reddit. But seriously, the included fans are good fans, and while the static pressure may be a little low, the front panel is so non-restrictive that they'll be adequate for pretty much any build you want to put in here. As far as thermal performance of this system as built, it's outstanding. This is where I usually add some temperature charts, but for this case, I really don't have to because there aren't enough numbers to chart. The CPU temperatures at idle were only 1 degree above baseline, baseline being the system on an open air test bench. That's where the numbers end, 1 degree. The CPU temps rose 1 degree at idle and under load. The GPU temps didn't rise at all. They stayed at the same as baseline at idle and under load. Honestly, when running the thermal test, I thought hardware monitor was malfunctioning, so I popped the front panel open, which still has the nylon filter installed, and nothing happened. Temp stayed the same. I rebooted, ran the test again, and same results. Of course, I do have my system configured with cooling efficiency in mind. As far as the system, it's actually my main workstation. I'm not going to go into detail about it here because I've already built this system on the channel. You can check that out here if you're curious and want to know more. Just know that the plans for a custom case for it are indefinitely on hold thanks to the current ongoing pandemic situation. So this, for all intents and purposes, is its new permanent home. And this case allowed me to configure it exactly how I wanted to. First, there's the storage, which I need. I deal with a lot of footage and media. It's also my Plex server and will become my family share Steam library for Steam Remote Play to basically every other device in the house. So yeah, I need a lot of low-cost storage solutions. I also need to keep the system relatively cool and quiet as possible, which I couldn't do in its old case. Now, don't get me wrong, the P400A is a good case, but wasn't designed for a system like this. So some of the choices I made for cooling are installing the AIO on the top of the case, almost all of the workloads I employ on this system are GPU intensive, so I want the GPU to have access to fresh, cool air from the unrestricted front panel. Now, to help out the CPU, I push the AIO radiator as far forward as possible to catch the front air from the fans too. I also have the fans configured with 3 140mm fans in the front and one 120mm fan on the bottom as an intake, and 4 120mm exhaust fans, the 3 AIO fans and the one rear. I set the fan curve to maintain a slightly positive pressure environment in the case. The bottom fan and lowest front fan and rear fan curves are set to the GPU temperature, while the top 2 fan curves are set to the CPU temperature. This allows for less fans needing to ramp up for CPU intensive tasks and increases the positive pressure as the GPU heats up. That way, a lot of the heat is basically blown out of the open PCI slots or pulled out of the rear fan before it can make its way to the top AIO. And it works exactly as I intended. The system stays cool and quiet. That's important because when I spent over $5,000 on this system, I committed to keeping it for at least 5 years. So this is the perfect case for me and my system, but who else is it for? Well, anyone like me who has lots of storage needs and wants to keep their stuff cool. It's the best I can think of on the market right now at this price point. In its original configuration, it's perfect for a mid-range to high-end workstation or gaming rig, especially if you want to custom water cool your system. These multi-brackets can also be used to mount pumps and reservoirs, and there's so much space in here for radiators, pumps, reservoirs, and tubing runs. Without being like huge, it still has a relatively modest footprint. Now, who is this case not for? Well, if you're just looking for a case for a typical ATX gaming system with a stock CPU cooler, mid-range aftermarket air cooler, or a 240mm AIO, and an M.2 drive and maybe a single SSD, then this is probably too much case for you. There will be a lot of open space, but it's okay. There will be a case for you. Now, this is 100% just an educated guess. I have no inside knowledge, and if I did, I wouldn't be able to make this prediction because I'd be under NDA, but I predict the next case, or one of the next cases released by Fractal, is the Meshify 2 Compact. I said it, mark my words, or don't. It's really only a guess, but I think it's very likely we'll see a version of the Define 7 Compact I reviewed last month in the not too distant future as a direct replacement for the Meshify C. Or not, I don't know. Like I said, it's just a guess. But that's my take on the Fractal Meshify 2. It's definitely a considerable upgrade over the Meshify S2. By the time I post this video, it should be available, hopefully at or very close to its $139.99 MSRP. If you're in the market for a case with great airflow and a bit more space for, well, anything, then I'd recommend checking it out. And if you need a lot more space, check out the XL version. That's it for this one, guys. As always, if you liked it, make sure you hit that like button and maybe consider subscribing. I hope to see you in the next one. Until then, stay safe.